Hi there, Church on Main. It's a great privilege to be welcoming you to our Sunday broadcast again. In a few moments, Fiona will be on screen, completing her week, looking at contentment, particularly the fruit of contentment. I wanted to just get on and say one or two things before she comes to speak. And I want to speak particularly about a prophetic word I heard. It's 52 days now of lockdown in South Africa, and there have been Zoom calls, there have been adjustments, online ministry for us as a church. Some folk in the church sadly have lost their jobs, and we're praying that God will provide them new gainful employment. Some have been struggling to get contracts. Some have landed some wonderful contracts. We celebrate with you. Some babies born in lockdown, a marriage just the day before. One of the young babies born has required blood transfusions, and we're still praying that he'll grow up to be a strong young lad and accomplish all that God's called him to. There's a lot that's been happening. So many moving parts, and yet so much uncertainty. Right at the beginning of this lockdown, I took us to Philippians chapter 4, which says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer, with petition and thanksgiving, present your requests to God." And He's the one who can then flood us with that peace that surpasses understanding and will bless our hearts and our minds with that peace. And so we're trusting and we're putting our trust in God by committing all these things to Him in prayer, because of the uncertainty which we face. Well, I want to say that on one of these Zoom calls particularly, there was a moment where we had a prophetic word. I want to play that for you. So listen to it. I only have the audio available for you here, and I hope that clip can be spliced in nicely for you to listen to. The background is this. I've been having many people ask me, what is God saying? I've had many discussions. What is God doing through this? Firstly, I just want to say that I'm not one of those who believes that this is God doing it, but in all circumstances, God works. And in this circumstance, we were on a Zoom call, and a particular Mark Sayers, who wrote a book last year called Reappearing Church, in which, and I quote from his book, this is in the second half of last year, and he's talking about things which could affect the church into the future. And this is one of his comments. He says, "If we endured a global flu pandemic like the one in the early part of the 20th century that killed millions of people across the world, how we view and process our personal potentials and possibilities would be deeply shaken." He gives other examples of if the NATO tensions go, or if North Korea pops, but that's one of the things he says. If there was a global flu pandemic, how would it affect us? And on the call, the Zoom call, he prophesies into the context of South Africa. And it was quite a moving and inspiring moment for me. If you say, what is God saying and what is God doing? This is one of the things which has spoken to me. So we're going to play that for you. Thanks for listening in. And then you get to hear Fiona speak on contentment.
What I began to notice as I sort of put this flag up the flagpole is that God was doing that, I think, across the world. I really felt God saying to me at one point in a moment of prayer that the next thing that He wanted to do was not actually gather more superstars, but actually gather the humble. You know, His word tells us that He lifts up the humble and He pulls down the proud. And I felt like partially what was happening there was almost in the last little while, God was like looking across the face of the world. Who are the people who have been pushing into me and having victories in the hidden places? You know, I would love to encourage you, whether you're in South Africa or your origins are in South Africa. One of the things that I said yes to this call, and I have many, many opportunities. I turned down a call. Literally, I was trying to connect back onto the internet from a large church wanting to speak to me on Zoom. I said yes to this call because for the last 18 months, God has been pointing several countries to me. And in a sense, what I felt God saying is that He wants to elevate countries as hubs in the next moment. One of those countries clearly to me was South Africa. I believe that God has a moment coming for South Africa And that what South Africa is, in a sense, when South Africa may look at the rest of the world and look at countries, and there's been this movement out of South Africa, diaspora amongst many people, that actually there's this moment where what we're seeing at the moment is quite incredible. What we're seeing at the moment is that the global superpowers have actually, in a sense, been humiliated and not looked as powerful as we thought. And there's this interesting thing where there's a second rung of countries who are actually handling this better. And I wonder if there's actually a moment for South Africa, for Zimbabwe, these countries where actually God is now going from just a sort of everything moving to one place, but actually a distribution to various hubs through the world. We live at a moment of globalization. Whenever there's been multiple moments of globalization happen in the world. One of them was the first century, when the Roman road connected the world, and the world was connected with its potential, and the gospel went out. Another one was in the 18th century, which many of our church traditions can go back to, when the gospel went out from the British Empire to the ends of the world, to strange colonial places like Southern Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And what if this actually a moment where we're now at these hubs, and what if South Africa is a place? And you know what's fascinating about South Africa? Everything is happening in South Africa all at once. You have a multiplicity of cultures. You have first, second, third world all alongside each other. You have traditional cultures plus right-wing pushing into the new left-wing stuff. You've got the culture wars. You've got a term like state capture, which actually is going to be a term that you're going to hear more around the world. You've actually got these things happening in this particular place. And I actually think what's happening is that a place like South Africa is a laboratory of what a globalized world is going to look like going forward. The different things that the world is now facing in many Western countries around tribalism and polarity and racism and inequality and these are things that the South African church has wrestled with for years. That there's a sense of the South African context actually builds a resilience. And the latest research done by Barna, the whole question that Barna's doing, 26 countries around the world, I was part of this in Australia and in presenting this material, is the question they're asking is, how do we actually create resilient disciples? You live in a context in Southern Africa, or even coming from South Africa, where you have ingrained in you a kind of resilience that many other people in other contexts don't have. God has actually used South Africa and placed it and used Southern Africa as a hub that's going to be a hub for both Africa, but also because of the diaspora, so many places across the world, and actually believe that there needs to be a reframing at this moment, that what if God's actually positioning in this new complete global political, geopolitical rearranging of the world, positioning South Africa for a place of influence in the next thing, if people are hungry and humble. And I know there was the Blessing UK video that I watched the other day, but I saw the South African one before that. And as I watched that, I just had this sense that there's a song for South Africa to sing at this point in time. And what God has done is kept you in place in your country, which is really interesting. And there's an element to actually, I believe in that. I'm like, God, I travel around the world, but now I'm in Melbourne. I'm now stuck here. What do you want me to see? What are the seeds of renewal that I'm missing in the ground upon which I walk? And what are the seeds of renewal that God has placed in South Africa that are actually going to grow into fruit to bless the world?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday morning message. I hope you're all well. Thank you so much for joining us. This week in our Daily Bread messages, we've been journeying through the theme of contentment, and we've been looking at the scriptures in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 to 13. We've been looking at this book, which is a book of joy written in not such joyful circumstances, with Paul being in prison. Verse 13 has been the key that we've looked at. The secret of being content for Paul was finding his strength in Christ. That word content, the word that in its secular Greek use means a standalone self-sufficiency. And we learned that Paul actually changes the way that word is used. He uses it differently by adding or infusing it with a God-centered reliance on Christ. a trusting in God and his sufficiency. In Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 8, it's put like this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones." C.S. Lewis said this about our sufficiency in God: "God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing." During the week, we looked at the fruit of discontent, that it makes us tired and restless. In our world, there is this insatiable desire for more. People look to external circumstances to provide fulfillment and contentment. I read a quote in a book recently, and the author apologized for not having a source for the quote, and so I'm using the same apology and that quote today. It reads like this: "The good life exists only when we stop wanting a better one. The itch for things is a virus draining the soul of contentment." Jesus says in Matthew 11, "Come to me and you will find rest for your souls." He is the source of the good life. He is the good life. We have also looked at the difficulty in living in this liminal space. Liminal spaces are transitional ones. They're in between places. And we found ourselves in one at the moment, and the difficulty is that we don't actually know how long it's going to last. Everything about our daily life has changed in so short a time that our bodies and minds are still catching up and taking time to process and metabolize it all. As Christians, we do actually also live with the sense of being in between people. We live in an in-between space as Christians. We live between Jesus' first coming on earth and his second coming, his return one day. Our home is heaven, and our time on earth is a kind of in-between. It's a time of opportunity, though, and a time given to us for fruitfulness. This week, we've explored aspects of contentment and the secret of contentment. I want us to now look for a bit at the fruit of contentment. If we live content, as Paul was able to say he did, it will shift our focus. Contentment produces an outward focus. It relieves us from ourselves and from an excessive inward view. Contentment produces a quieted soul. Where discontent makes us restless, the fruit of contentment is peace. There's a beautiful psalm, Psalm 131. It's 3 short verses. It says this: "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up." David, the psalmist, is saying, I'm not proud or haughty. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord, from this time forth and forevermore. Contentedness produces fruitfulness. Paul lived this message with purpose and perspective. When writing Philippians, Paul was in prison. How could it be that he could be fruitful and live in his call while he was in prison? Paul the preacher was captive, but Paul found that he had a captive audience. Paul slips out this encouraging news to the readers of his letter. It's very similar to Joseph's words and echoes what Joseph says to his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20. Jacob, their father, has died, and the brothers are worried that now Joseph suddenly will turn on them in revenge for what they did to him when he was much younger. Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." In Philippians 1, verse 12, Paul says this: "I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." Paul was able to look outward. He was able to be content in all circumstances. He lives with this amazing sense of purpose and this perspective. He's saying, what is happening to me is encouraging people out there to be bold, and there's a purpose for me right here, right now in prison. There may be some intended irony in Paul's writing as he ends this letter. In Philippians 4, verse 22, he says, "All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household." People in the household where he is being held captive have responded to the message that Paul's been preaching to them. This is perhaps a small hint that arresting Paul was the surest way of starting a little church in a prison where he was being held. Paul had learned the secret of being content. He found strength and sufficiency in Jesus. Paul's contentment led him to fruitfulness, to a shift in focus from hardship to opportunity. I'm going to end with the final verse of this amazing letter, this epistle of joy. "The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit." Bless you today. May you find much peace and joy in the Spirit.